Okay, today we are going to talk about Web3, which is a buzzword that a lot of people are talking about at the moment. And especially, I want to talk about why it might be too early to get excited about Web3. And to join me in this conversation is Tim O'Reilly, who is the founder of O'Reilly Media. Hi, Tim.
Hi, I'm glad to be on the show.
I'm so looking forward to this. You popularized terms such as open source and Web 2.0, which hopefully makes it super exciting to talk about the potential of Web 3.0 or Web 3. And you're also the author of a book, WFT. What's the
WTF.
sorry?
WTF.
WTF, of course. Yeah. What's the future and why it's up to us? So today we're going to talk about Web3 and then look at some of the lessons that you've learned as a very prominent figure in this whole tech and data space. And maybe before we do this, you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. Where are you joining us from today, first of all?
I'm in Northern Virginia today visiting family.
Very good. So, if you briefly give us an overview of your background and how you spent your time today, that would be super useful.
Oh, well, it's still relatively early here, so I've been up drinking my tea, catching up with email, and getting ready to talk with you. So not much today, but
Very
over the
good.
past few days we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of my dad's birth. He died though 40 years ago, and I'm here also for my brother's 70th birthday next week. So
Very good. And so your background then, you've started and founded O'Reilly Media. How did this all happen and how did you get into this whole world of tech and data?
yeah, well, many years ago, it's now got to be almost 45 years ago. I had a friend who was a computer programmer who got asked to write a manual. Uh, he didn't know how to write. I knew nothing about computers, but I said I'd help him out. And we formed a partnership where we'd go in and to write manuals, we'd go in and we'd talk to the people, and he would be able to understand what they were saying, and then I would write it down. And eventually, I learned. He never did learn how to write, but I did learn about computers and fell in love with them. So the company's been around for over 40 years. We were originally a technical writing consultancy. Then we became a publisher. We became a conference producer. But today we're mostly known as the we for technology. It's a collection of tens of thousands of technology and business related ebooks, tens of thousands of hours of video training, live training, interactive tools where you can explore technology. We're probably different from any of the other players in the space in that we are really optimized for not just for people who are trying to enter the field and learn things from the ground up, but really for practitioners. Or it's a business subscription where people can find answers to really hard technical problems.
Very good. So let's start talking about Web3 then. So the vision of Web3 is that is the third age of the internet. The aim is to redefine, I guess, the notion of control and address some of the flaws of the current state of the internet. Um, Namely creating apps that in the words of Tim Berners-Lee help them to do what they want and need to do without spying on them. And especially the aim is to achieve this through decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
So, from your point of view, how realistic is this vision?
Well, I would start out by saying, in some ways, the defining characteristic, the defining arc of my career has been watching and observing and participating in cycles of decentralization followed by recentralization. And that was fairly central to my thinking about Web 2, which, by the way, was not intended as a version number, but was really a description of why the web was coming back after the dot-com bust and everybody thought it was over. And we were trying to identify the things that distinguished the companies that succeeded from those that failed. And that really shapes my thinking about Web3 as well, because it's very hard to see in advance, particularly when there's a bubble going on, which I think there is right now, what's important. But let me return to your question of centralization and decentralization. When I entered the industry, IBM was still the big dog, and they controlled the industry through hardware. They basically had hardware specifications, and the industry was centered around IBM. And then they made a mistake. They created the personal computer. They were trying to catch up with this new small market that nobody cared about. And they decided to use industry standard, components. And the specs got published, and people started making, personal computers that were not made by IBM, but were compatible with that standard. And they really lost control of the future because it turned out not to be a small market. So the PC was fundamentally decentralizing. I remember Microsoft's early slogan was a PC, in every home and on every desk. But what was really interesting was that Microsoft then figured out how to use software and the operating system to become the locus of centralization. And then they became the big bad dog. And then along comes the internet and the open protocols of the internet, a communication-centered world that we live in today, as well as open source software. And once again, we saw all this rhetoric of the reality of decentralization. Anyone could have their own website. At OReilly, we created the first commercial website and the first commercial web portal, and it was hugely energizing, and we really believed in that rhetoric, of decentralization. But gradually, we started to see that there was a new locus for centralization, and that's where I kind of really shaped this part of my thinking. I said, oh, it's going to be data, and I started calling that really around 2000, 2001, that there was a new kind of centralization that was going to happen, not through software, but through data and these big internet sites. And so I think what we really need to understand is that there's this thing that Clayton Christensen, the famous business guru, called the law of conservation of attractive profits. And that is that when one thing becomes a commodity, something else, something usually adjacent, becomes valuable. So hardware became a commodity with the PC, software became valuable, software became kind of a commodity, and the adjacency was to data. Now the question is, what's going to be the adjacency for this so-called decentralization of Web3? We don't really know long-term what it's going to be, but even in the first phase of Web3, which is generally associated very heavily with cryptocurrencies and the whole crypto market, things like NFTs, we see immense centralization. And the first centralization was around Bitcoin, where the locus of centralization was cheap power, because it took so much power to mine. And as a result, despite all this rhetoric of decentralization, most cryptocurrencies are owned by a relatively small number of people. It actually concentrated way more quickly than the web did, the original web. And so you have a small number of crypto billionaires, who have vast wealth, so we've already seen that centralization, but it's beyond that. You see markets like NFTs, when there's a lot of rhetoric about, wow, this is going to empower artists and all the creators will be able to get paid. But we see these big aggregators who are already at the center of that market, just like they were with the web. So I just think that the rhetoric of decentralization is something that comes along, and it's something we all need to believe in, because it's how you get a refresh on who's in charge. If you don't get that refresh, you get the same incumbents who get more and more locked into their position. They get more and more stuck in their ways. And innovation comes when there is decentralization. But I guess I have to say, based on my, decades here, this seems less empowering to me than, for example, the web or the PC revolution before it. It doesn't really live up to the hype. But that being said, it doesn't mean that it's not important. There's a lot going on there. The biggest problem I see with it really is that there's just too much money chasing this future. In my experience, the most interesting technology revolutions where decentralization has had time to enable innovation has been in periods when there's not any money to be made. The original personal computer revolution, nobody thought it was a big market. I think IBM originally projected it would be 40,000 computers, and the original World Wide Web, nobody was excited about it. They thought it was all going to be stuff from AOL and Microsoft. And then we had the dot-com bust, and nobody thought that we would see the emergence of people like Google, who kind of were still kind of just coming at the tail end of that first wave. And so there's all this innovation when people think that there's no money to be made. When there's money to be made, you get all the, basically, I think you see this in the recent battle of titans between Jack Dorsey and Mark Andreessen, Mark being the venture capitalist who's most associated with backing cryptocurrencies. And Jack is a big crypto fan, but he says, look, this is not decentralized. It's owned by the VCs. And he's right. There's so much money pouring into this space. And there was a great article just the other day by a longtime computer scientist who's been interested in cryptocurrencies or just really networking and decentralization for decades, David Rosenthal. And he pointed out that by definition, for decentralization to work, the thing has to be a commodity, and VCs hate commodities, right? They can't make money. So because there's so much money here, you're going to end up inevitably moving away from that decentralized opportunity for everybody to ones where there are big defensible moats, and that's what all this money is chasing. So the financialization of this space, I think, is probably the strongest argument. The technical arguments where computer scientists say, well, a lot of this doesn't really work very well yet, will be overcome. But the business argument, has always been that people are looking for those outsized profits, and that's what eventually leads to the recentralization. And it's happening very quickly here.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess that the web as we know it today has led to huge monopolies. Companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have created huge monopolies built on the data they can extract from the internet. And do you see something similar happening in Web3?
Maybe, but let me just start with how they have amassed enormous power, Google and Amazon and the like. They have amassed power by delivering real value, quite honestly. Yes, and this is kind of another thing you have to understand about these long technology cycles, is both Google and Amazon started out being real value creators for their users. Just think about all of the free services that we get from Google. Not, first of all, the original service, which was just the ability to search, the trillions of web pages and just find answers. That was world changing. And then you think, well, they give us, Google Maps. We can get anywhere. Everybody can now get around. We have free email. We have free photo storage. Again, they start to monetize over time. But originally, they just like, wow, let's just create value. Amazon, you can get stuff, anything, almost immediately, at better prices than you could before. So these were companies that created value in a truly disruptive, effective way. There's this idea in economics of what they call rents, which is the ability to, of a company to extract super normal profits. And there's two ways to get rents. I actually boil all the economics down and all the fine nuance down into two kinds of rents. There's what I could call rising tide rents, which are like positive externalities. Here are these early pioneers of the internet, people like Amazon and Google were like, hey, let's build this amazing thing. And because they were inventing it, they were always out ahead of the curve. And so they were rising with the tide of the internet as we all discovered its possibilities. And then at a certain point, that growth starts to slow. And then they turn to the other general category of rents, which I call robber baron rents, kind of going back to the Middle Ages, where the barons' men show up and they say, yes, we'll take your crops, the baron up the taxes, and that kind of behavior you see as for example, Google and Amazon start, saying, well, we're going to put ads instead of ordinary search results. Amazon's ads business is a great example of this. It used to be that you searched on Amazon and you found they had all the collective intelligence of big data to say, this is the best product for you at the best price. And now what do you see when you go to Amazon? You have to scroll way down before you see those collective intelligence results. You see ads. And so that's a step backwards. And so I think that's a way more important perspective than they're collecting all this data and that's given them all this power. Because the fact is, if they're using the data for us, that's a really good thing. When Google is using our data to say, oh, we actually think this is the best result because we've been watching what people do when they search results and they click on the third result more often and stay away like they got a good result than they do on the first result. We're going to adjust it. That's using data for us. When Google tells us, go this route because that one is there's an accident on the bridge, that's using data for us. When they say, this might have been the best result, but we're going to show you our stuff because it makes us more money. That's using our data against us. And I think that distinction seems more important to me than we're collecting data, because part of the big data future that we want is one where the systems that are supposed to help us are getting better and better at it. And the companies still think they are doing that. They just aren't, they just start to lose the plot. And they start going, well, it's really better for our users if we do this thing that really is better for us too, and the boundaries start to blur. But anyway, so the Web3 narrative is sort of a reaction to that, but I don't really see it addressing that problem. And there's a couple of different threads, of course, in Web3. There's Tim Berners-Lee, who was the original creator of the web, and he's the first one who started using the Web3 term. And he's kind of trying to address that centralization of the web and go back to the original vision that he had of, decentralized empowerment and free information flow. Things that he was building don't have wide adoption. Also ended up being used by, cryptocurrency people. It was originally coined, as it's currently used today, by Gavin Wood, who's one of the founders of Ethereum. And it's really about this idea of apps built on the blockchain, which is the substrate of cryptocurrencies and NFTs and technologies like that. And those two things are very, very different. And the idea of that the blockchain is decentralizing, again, there are people who are working on it, but as I mentioned already, I don't see that we're getting there, or that with all the financial pressures that we will get there.
Very good. So Web3 is definitely making some people very rich. Others are very much expressing their anger and hatred over it, likening Web3 to a Ponzi scheme. And the pushback, I guess, seems to echo that of the financial crisis of 2008, stemming from the realization that people who are not involved in investing in crypto will still experience negative ramifications when the bubble, or if the bubble pops. So putting Web3 in the context of previous stock exchange bubbles, for example, what do you think will be left behind when the Web3 bubble pops, or will it pop?
Well, first off, it may or may not pop. There was a very good post by Noah Smith just this morning, where he was just talking about the amount of wealth that's been accumulated by the so-called crypto whales. And, what they put that wealth into is going to determine what happens next. If they put it into, crazy speculation, when the bubble pops, suddenly that crypto wealth will literally disappear. There's a concept I've been playing with quite a lot. This really comes originally from Carlota Perez, who's an Argentinian economist who wrote a wonderful book called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. But Bill Janeway, who's also he's a venture capitalist who's also an economist, has written about it in his book. And it really is this idea of there are productive bubbles. And Carlotta kind of points out there was a bubble that associated with virtually every major technological revolution, railroads, the whole complex of railroads and steel, and coal, for example. There was a canal bubble. There was an automobile bubble. There was you can kind of see this cycle repeat. And of course, what's left behind is the infrastructure of a long kind of golden age of that technology. Mm-hmm. And in some sense, you saw that very much with the dot-com bubble. There was a lot of companies went bankrupt, but left behind were data centers and dark fiber that could then be lit up later by the next generation of applications, not to mention all the know-how that led us to Google and Amazon in today's world. So, the question is, what will be left behind by this crypto bubble? And I think there's, on the positive side, there is very definitely, the hope that we'll see a development of an alternative financial system which disintermediates some of the big banks, that allows more peer-to-peer activity. Again, I moderate that in my own thinking with the fact that, well, there'll just be new intermediaries. But that's okay, because those new intermediaries can bring new kinds of value and give a kind of a refresh to the system. And so that's a good thing, even if it does end up re-centralizing. But we're not there yet, because there's already so much, fraud and problems in the crypto space that maybe, it's going to get regulated out of existence. But that was also possible with the early internet. We don't really know. But the other thing, there's a lot of action around NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which are really just this idea of how do you make a scarce digital asset, which is something that we haven't had before. And the digital was the explosion of everything being infinitely copyable, and the blockchain allowing for the creation of unique digital objects is a really interesting idea. But right now, it's having a lot of expression in kind of crazy collectibles. Will Bored Apes be like the next, owning the next Mona Lisa? No, they're going to be much more like owning a pet rock, I think. But that doesn't mean that there won't be valuable NFTs where there is some unique thing in the middle of all that bubble, where somebody says, "Oh, wait, this really is valuable to have a unique copy of this thing." And so, we're going to see a lot of exploration of the possibility space. But the most important thing, I would think, would be there's also going to be a lot of spillover, where people who make their money, change society in other ways. You can think about this in the way that, for example, Andrew Carnegie, who made his money in steel, also ended up building the public library system, or kickstarting it. And I think there's some really great examples of that that may come out of blockchain or come out of the Web3 crypto world, but I'm not sure I see it yet, but I suspect it will. But you see it in a different bubble area, which is with Elon Musk. The value of Tesla is so high. Elon Musk isn't the world's richest man in the same way that John D. Rockefeller was. It's very, very different. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil was just minting money. Bill Gates, Microsoft was minting money. And so, and same thing, Larry and Sergey, Google mints money, Facebook, mints money. But Tesla doesn't mint money. Tesla barely makes any money. In fact, if you look at the price earnings ratio, when I looked it up when Elon Musk first became the world's richest man, and it would have taken you 1,500 years, to earn out the price of a share. But what did Elon do with that bubble wealth? News is out right now. He just gave away a few $1 billion worth of $5 or $6 billion worth of Tesla shares. But that's not the most important thing he did. He built factories. He transformed the electric car industry. And then he took other parts of it and he kind of helped fund SpaceX. He got that funded as well. He's now built, a satellite network. He's built, gigafactory for batteries. So there's all this stuff. If Tesla stock went poof, there'd be all this stuff left. And I think that's a really important thing to think about with the bubble. The bubble in Tesla stock has been incredibly productive for the economy. And that's what you want a bubble for. And so the jury is out, I think, on whether the crypto bubble is going to create something of lasting value or whether it's going to be like the tulip bubble in 16th century Holland that kind of was the first true financial bubble.
So in order to make Web3 a reality, this general purpose financial system, something that really generates value, do you think we're there in terms of infrastructure, or do you think we need to build and invest in new infrastructure to make it a reality?
I think there are many, many, many technical problems ahead. Now, that was also true with the original World Wide Web. When it was launched in the early 90s, it didn't work that well. At O'Reilly, we did the first commercial website. We had to try to convince, we did a telephone survey of 50,000 people to say, oh yeah, advertising could work on the internet. Would you, and then it really took another 10 years for that advertising infrastructure to get built, and it continued to, it's still continuing to grow and take share and become more sophisticated. Here we are 22, 23 years on, and so I won't say it won't happen. I do think that the crypto world has bitten off some very, very hard problems that seem very difficult to solve. The Ethereum community has been working on moving off of proof of work, which is the way that Bitcoin works. Basically these systems have to achieve consensus before a block gets written. And that's a very expensive computational and energy intensive process. And, the Ethereum community has been trying to move to something called proof of stake, and they still haven't gotten it to work. And so there are some hard technology problems there. Money flooding into the space. It's possible that there's some breakthroughs. I think the way I think about it is just that there's a little bit of a timing mismatch between the frenzy and the reality. When the internet first came out, in the late 60s, there was all those things were possible, but it wasn't until the World Wide Web came along, 1989, actually didn't really start to really take off till 91, 92, that we actually had the killer app for the internet. Email was great, but it wasn't the kind of game changer that the web was. And it may be that one day, or maybe it's already there, and we just haven't seen it yet. There's this killer app for what you're going to do with Web3. I tend to, people maybe think it's NFTs, or I'm actually a little bit more interested in DAOs, the distributed autonomous organizations, because I do think there's something really potentially interesting there. But it's still so early. Here we are at the very beginning. if you think about when was the first search engine, web crawler, I think was 1994. You started to have this thing called CGI, which is that you could literally have a dynamic website instead of a static website around that same time. And we're kind of about that stage. So we have the late stage bubble 5 years too early, like where there's just huge fortunes being made long before the technology is really developed, or even the winning players have emerged. Google wasn't founded for another 5 years if we're matching up the timelines. So the crypto Google still is not here. It may not be here for another 5 years, and yet the current companies are being valued as if they're already this dominant working future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So in terms of, or beyond infrastructure, then what else do you think needs to happen for skeptics to see a major societal shift like Web3 and the benefits it could bring?
Well, the thing that's really hard is, okay, again, I think a lot by analogy, because it's very hard to see the future, as it's unfolding. We almost always get it wrong. It's like the horseless carriage problem. So, what you're looking for is somebody who really reinvents things. And, you can think about, say, when I created the first internet ad, so to speak, I was coming from, we were selling our books by direct mail. So I thought about direct mail as the analogy, and I went, oh, okay, because at the time, think back to in 1990, if you want to get more information about a company's product, you saw this ad in a magazine, and they had this little thing called a bingo card, and you circled number 99, and they sent you a brochure in the mail. And I went, wow, the web could totally replace that. Instead of a bingo card, everybody could have a commercial website, and a URL will just point people to it, and we'll have a catalog of those things, right? Because right up to that point, the internet had been so profoundly non-commercial. And that, yes, so in some sense, that became universal. It became just what everybody did. You had a commercial website. So I was totally right about that. But that wasn't where the money was to be made. And then the next people came along and said, well, we got to have pointers to those websites. So we're now going to have these banner ads, and there was a whole banner ad phase, right? And everybody thought, oh, that's where the fortunes are going to be made. And then it turns out along comes Google 5 or 6 years later. Actually, it started with Yahoo, but Google was the one who perfected it. No, it's actually search advertising, and it's pay per click, a fundamental innovation in the way you don't just try to get eyeballs, you actually get people to do something. And that change was what became the beginning of all the big data revolution in a certain way, where you started to understand people's behavior by what they did. Mm-hmm. And you could do things that were much more targeted. And we suddenly clicked into this groove that's taken us down the next 10 years till it's now or 10 or 15 years. So it's now kind of gone too far, but where you're understanding your users. And so here we are. The way I think about it is, we're still in this very early stage where we don't really know what's going to work. We're having some analogies, and those analogies are almost certain to be wrong and imperfect. And it's a great, another great story. I love just sort of these images. There's a wonderful book, which was made in a movie by Orson Welles, called The Magnificent Ambersons. And it was basically about the early days of the auto industry. And there's this family whose fortunes were made in the previous generation, and they're trying to latch on to the new thing. And this guy is, our fortune's going to be saved by automobile headlights, right? And they, these cars are going to need lights at night, and they can be charged by the battery and the motion of, all the ideas that we have today, where you just take for granted as headlights. But the problem is that there's still a lot of horses on the roads, and the cars can't go fast enough to charge the battery to run the lights, and it's just like one of those great, I don't even know it's true, but this is a book written in the 30s. But it's a wonderful, story about how you can be right, but all the pieces aren't there for this thing to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are in that phase where, we're still, first of all, we're trying to replicate, the early visions often are, well, we're going to try to replicate something that happens now. It'll like, wow, we'll have an e-notary powered by blockchain. I go, great, that's perfect. But then, given that everything in the blockchain is non-reputable, maybe you don't even need a notary. How does that work? There's going to be some innovation, and that's a very small market. But you think about, there's so many areas where somebody's going to invent a totally new way to do something, in the same way that pay-per-click advertising was utterly transformative to the ad business. There'll be something perhaps that will be utterly transformative for finance. And that's where things like DAOs or DAOs are really interesting, because what they are actually doing is in a lot of ways, it's like a Kickstarter, but it's got some different elements that make it more powerful, where people can come together and they can finance a project, collectively. And, it really only works if you already have a lot of crypto, I think. It's like if you don't have crypto wealth, it's like, why would it doesn't do anything? Like, why wouldn't you just do a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe or whatever? But they haven't really figured out all the ways that it works. The governance, how does that actually work? How does it actually buy real world assets and literally control them, so that the people who contributed the funds, right now, most of them are kind of kludged together. But guess what? That was how the web worked in the early days, where it was sort of kludged. Wow, we can actually have this thing where you can have a database behind it, and it was this thing called CGI, the Common Gateway Interface, which let you call a database and have a dynamic web page. And then the technology went to work, and that just became the fabric of how you built websites. And I think in a similar way, there's all of these things where we go, okay, well, how does this, this idea of a collective, organization, a distributed autonomous organization, actually own something? And what's the legal interface to that? And how does it just happen automatically? And all of a sudden, if somebody gets that to really work, maybe you have an alternative to, say, underwriting, a company, with a public offering via, Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, right? And suddenly those big guys are facing this new competition. Now, again, I suspect even if that happens, it's not that you're going to have this true democratization. You'll just have, a new rival to Goldman Sachs, in the same way that, Google and Facebook became rivals to the existing media empires.
Yeah, no, I agree that at the moment it's early days. We don't even know what innovations might follow on. Mm-hmm. Currently, there's a lot of focus on easy riches, NFTs, and on solving problems in terms of trust and transparency, I guess. So what else do you think Web3 is capable of, and how can innovators use Web3 to, for example, create life-changing goods and services that make life better for everyone?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know the answer. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, there's too much money in the space already. And that means that people are less focused on, not everybody. There are idealists who are working, and they're the ones who are, I think, ultimately going to win. But there's an awful lot of people who aren't sitting there saying, how are we going to make life-changing goods and services? They're saying, how are we going to make a fortune? Mm-hmm. And my experience, most of the people who are doing that are some of them are going to, get in and get out and get very rich and leave others to pick up the pieces. But, it's interesting. If you look at most of the great companies that stick around, most, but not all, ended up making a lot of money pretty early. Google was a money machine early. They had actually figured out how to do something that people really wanted. and that had real value. And I think that value creation is the ultimate goal. And if you stay focused on that as an entrepreneur, you'll find something. But I have to say, I think that there's a lot of hope in this field, and I think that that's a good thing. Just like there was with free software and open source, the idealism is this powerful force for change. And my sadness, as I say, is that there's been so much of a gold rush mentality too soon.
Yeah, interesting.
Compared to some of these past revolutions where the gold rush came later.
It's definitely a super interesting space to watch.
Yes, it is.
Let's shift gears a bit and focus on your book, WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. So in a nutshell, it covers the lessons that you've learned about technology platforms from 4 decades in the industry and how they apply both to businesses and the broader economy. And you mentioned that current society is rampant with inequality, but technology is the solution to human problems. What specifically do you think must happen in the business world and in the economy to create a more human-centered future?
That's a really good question. I think that when I wrote the book, it was really shaped by a lot by my thinking about artificial intelligence, which was the previous little. It sort of had its little bubble moment, and now people are skeptical. Although I think it's actually now really entering some of its most powerful phase as a game changer. But one of the ideas that I was looking at was that most machine learning systems are really told to optimize for something. There's literally this idea of an optimization function. Although it's for an odd reason that isn't worth explaining to your reader, it's often described as a loss function. But it's really about what are you going to optimize for? So Google optimized originally for you come to our site, and the faster you go away satisfied, the better off we are, right? It means you found what you were looking for. Now they've changed that optimization function, and they want to make you stick around, just like Facebook does. Facebook had a very different optimization function, which is we want you to be engaged. We want you to spend more time here. And they built their systems to reinforce that. And so I took that idea of the optimization function that you see in these big data systems and said, well, what's the optimization function for our economy as a whole? Because I believe that our financial system and our economy is much more like Facebook and Google than people realize. It's first of all, it's almost entirely digital now. Money moves around, and these vast systems. If you look at a Wall Street data center or versus a Google data center, they look pretty similar. And there's a whole lot of bots at work doing all kinds of things to keep the system running, to make money. And all of those things have an optimization function. Well, what is that optimization function that drives our economy? And it turns out, if you look at it, it's corporate profits. It's like make more money. And I kind of take a look back, as I tend to do in history, and I said, well, if you look at the period after World War II, which was one of the most prosperous in history, where prosperity was broad-based, the optimization function was full employment. Literally the economy was they were worried like heck because they just gone through this period of the Great Depression, hyperinflation in Germany, which had led to World War II. And it went, we don't want to do that again. So, they came back, you had the Marshall Plan, let's rebuild Europe, let's rebuild Japan. They had the GI Bill, let's put all these returning GIs, we'll get them education, we'll get them a house or a farm. You had, all these things that were aimed at optimizing for broad-based prosperity. But that ended up, as things do, leading to unforeseen problems, the biggest of which was inflation. Inflation got really out of control. They had to break inflation. And then one of the things that they figured out was that, well, we're going to optimize for something different, and that's corporate profits. And they did that by basically saying, well, the right way to do this is to align the interests of management with the interests of shareholders. I.e., you start paying your CEO and top management in stock, and then they'll want to make the stock price go up. And so you look at that in our economy, for example, and you say, wow, we had all the money in the world to prop up stock prices for the last 10 years after the financial crisis of 2000, actually almost 13 years. But then, along comes the pandemic, and we're suddenly fighting over, there's not enough to go around to actually support ordinary people through this. We did it, actually. We did a lot more on it, and it worked. But we're still there. We're kind of stuck in the same way that Facebook is addicted to, you got to have clickbait. You got to have people who will, keep coming, keep sticking around, and they're desperately trying to keep that going. Our, global economy is addicted to rising stock prices, and all of this energy is going towards keeping that addiction going. And it's very hard to figure out, just as it's hard for Facebook to figure out how to back down from, the things that make people angry, that make people divisive. It's very hard for, actually it's not just Facebook, it's our real entire media ecosystem, that plays right along with that while complaining about it. But we have this, similar addiction. And so we have a crisis like, a pandemic or climate change, and we say we don't have enough resources to spend on it, because how do we stop this prosperity engine, which is this kind of funny money bubble that we have in financial markets? And I think it's going to be a tough switchover. But in my book, I actually talk about the need to change that objective function for society, because there is plenty to do in the what I call the operating economy. Some people call it the real economy, but it's all real. It's all a fiction. The economy from the bottom up is a collective fiction. It's like we all believe in this thing, so it works. But money isn't real. It's like, wow, I'm going to give you this beat up old piece of paper, and you consider it valuable, or I'm going to give you this, these digits in a bank account, and you believe it's valuable. It's a massive system of belief and trust. And but what do we point it at? And I think there's enough to go around to really build an economy that works for everyone, that addresses inequality, that tackles problems like climate change. And the market is a good way to do that. The market is a big part of that, like when I talk about for example, the way that the market's reaction to, Elon Musk is going to drive us to more and more of I think there's going to be a climate bubble, so to speak, and lots of climate billionaires. And I think that's a good thing. But because it's one way that we harness the energy of able to go a particular direction. That the profit motive is one way to do that, but it needs to be managed. And that's the thing. One of the big things that I've spent a lot of my last 10, 15 years on is looking at the analogy between say government as sort of the kind of like the platform technology for society. It's like government has a lot in common with Google and Facebook and Amazon, except it doesn't work very well, and it's not very susceptible to competition, so it's not getting better fast enough. But it is the platform for our society. Central banks say, we're going to optimize for these things. We're going to try to control inflation. And that's very much like Facebook saying, well, we're going to do these things to control what people see in the newsfeed, or Google, this is how we're going to make search results better, and so tax policy and what we invest in, what governments decide they're going to put their resources towards, are platform management decisions for the economy. The market doesn't just happen by itself. And so decisions, for example, about antitrust, do we want really big companies or do we want to support more small companies? These are really critical, platform decisions. And I guess this comes back around to decentralization. If we want to believe in decentralization, we have to, it's not going to just happen through, some magic technology solution. And this is why, again, I struggle with the decentralization rhetoric coupled with this, pursuit of vast wealth, because pursuit of vast wealth, of course, is whether it's a Ponzi scheme, it's certainly a pyramid where there's a smaller number of people who get the vast wealth, and maybe there's a trickle down, but maybe there isn't. Maybe it's a trickle up. And we need to actually say, well, if we want broad-based prosperity, how does that happen? And there's people who are saying, well, we get there by taxing the wealth a lot and doing universal basic income. There's other people who say, no, we just have to, my son-in-law, for example, wrote a book called Electrify about why, the electrification of America, and now he's written another one about Australia, where he's from, is the way to actually solve the jobs problem. You put everybody to work, although that's no longer an issue like it was a few years ago. Everybody seemed, we're very low on unemployment, but it's how you reduce energy costs. It's how you deal with climate change. And so there's a choice there. Do we continue to subsidize this shift to alternative energy sources from oil and gas? And I think we do. And if we pull that off, there's going to be a lot of investment chasing that. I think there's a big biotech revolution that needs to happen, because we're going to need to be able to adapt more quickly in terms of crops to different, different climate, as well as just the opportunity that comes from innovation. You think about things like synthetic meat that we're now, taking off as an industry. And, what's the structure of that biotech industry going to be? I've been talking with Drew Endy recently, and he's like, look, there's a whole decentralization narrative there too. Do we want our future biotech industry to be, look like our current big ag, or do we want it to look like, the small farmers, that we actually displaced? There's, and you look at how much government policy really shapes those kinds of things. When there was actually I can't remember whether it was on Planet Money or on This American Life. There was a great story about the meatpacking industry and how it had been, centralized in the, in the boom times of the early part of the century. They were squeezing out all the farmers. FDR came and, they basically regulated that industry, and you got prosperity back for ranchers. And now it's, under Reagan, it got deregulated. And now, it's now all the farmers are squeezed out because all the profits go to the meat packers. And, you kind of think that's anyway, I guess my point is I see so much of our society through the lens of what you can see at big tech. So everybody's focused on what's wrong with big tech. And I go, use that as a lens through which to see our society, because these companies and the way they're misbehaving is a reflection of what we value as a society and what we have told our companies to do. And if we want a different result, we have to tell them to do something differently. Just like Facebook could tell its newsfeed to do something differently, but they don't. Why don't they? Because the market tells them that, no, if that makes your profits go down, that would be very, very bad. And they built a machine that requires them, they pay their employees in stock, so they're going to not be able to have the talented engineers unless their stock price keeps going up. This whole machine. It's a little bit like, you bought a big, gas guzzling truck. You're going to fill it up with gas, regardless of your values. And if you want to have an energy efficient car, well, you got to start over. And I think, anyway, I guess I come back around to, this Web3 decentralization vision is a really important vision, but let's apply it to everything. particularly let's understand that the goal of creating enormous wealth is actually in opposition to this goal of decentralized prosperity, which people talk about. And if we really have decentralized prosperity, fewer people are going to be getting obscenely rich, and everyone is going to be getting richer. And I think that's also true of other technologies like artificial intelligence. It can make us all more prosperous, or it can make a small number of people so wealthy that they don't know what to do with their wealth.
Very true. So what single piece of advice would you give to companies who want to use technology that we have available today to shape a better future that can broadly benefit society and not just the entrepreneurial elites?
Well, I guess I would say that the first thing is to make sure that you think about all of the factors that make your company and your society successful. And so you see these companies that are thinking too much about only one thing. And that's something that, humans are pretty good at being able to satisfy multiple conditions and combine these things. And so, we used to have, we have this idea of the socially conscious corporation that thinks about, society and environmental goals and employees and so on. But we think of that as an exception. We have this special class of corporation, the B Corp, which is the, a public benefit corporation. You go, why aren't all corporations public benefit corporations? Why is it that it's a little bit like we say, well, most people are psychopaths, but there's a special kind of person who basically agrees to not be a psychopath, and, we'll give them a special designation. I go, no, wait, that's the wrong way around. We should have everybody aspiring to be, okay, we're looking to make our employees more prosperous. We're looking to make our community more prosperous. Hey, we pay taxes because we realize that, government really matters. And you see these companies that claim to have good values, like Apple, yet they're, big on tax avoidance. Who do they think is going to pay for, the infrastructure of our society if they're kind of going, well, not me, let the chumps pay taxes. That's not a company with good values. And so I think you start by saying, well, who are all the stakeholders? And I do think that there's a fundamental need for us to change corporate governance. And I think that really starts with, cutting this tie between executive compensation and stock prices. That was I think that's the biggest mistake. If there's a single big mistake that was made by our society in the last 40 years, that's probably it.
Why do you think that?
Well, because it basically told every public company that there was one party that mattered, and that was shareholders. Employees didn't matter. The environment didn't matter. Society didn't matter. With things like, hey, Purdue Pharma, let's lobby the FDA to say this drug OxyContin is not actually that addictive. There was this huge effort, to downplay its addictiveness, because, hey, it was good for the shareholders, and you kind of go, well, that's it's an aberration, but it isn't really. You look at, tobacco companies did that. Oil companies did that. Facebook is doing that. Everybody's kind of going, well, I'm doing these things, and you can come up with a story for yourself that says why, it's really okay. But, when you have a situation where the board of directors, who should be looking over this, is also compensated in company stock, is also, looking to see the stock price go up, you just don't have any corporate governance. So in some sense, we should be looking to make every company act like a B Corp. Although I do think also the B Corp has a lot of baggage associated with it that's, that's sort of not necessarily economically motivated. It's like trying to load it up with social goals as well, and I think that makes it harder for the whole thing to be adopted.
Very true. That was a fascinating conversation, Tim. Maybe we can finish off by looking at the hopes or maybe predictions that you have around technology Web3 for the future.
Well, first off, I guess I would just say I'm a big believer in decentralization. I think that and I'm a big believer in, kind of that refresh theory, in some sense of technology comes along, needs to upset the apple cart, give us a fresh start. I see a lot of that still possible in AI. For example, on O'Reilly.com, the O'Reilly platform, we have this machine learning based sort of search now that we did not have, previously, and it gives us the ability to search our content for the first time better than Google could. It's like, so AI, and it's machine learning based. In the same way that IBM released the specs to the PC, and that led to this decentralized PC world, I think we're seeing the beginnings of a decentralized AI world and what they call large foundation models, GPT-3 and and the like. It still has a lot of problems, but we're going to get to a place where there's a huge amount of accumulated human knowledge encapsulated in these models, and then you can build on top of them in a decentralized way. So I think there's a real decentralization story there that we haven't really twigged to yet, and it means that individual e-commerce sites are going to be able to compete better with Amazon. You look at the combination of Shopify, which is sort of an enabler of e-commerce, but not a centralizer of e-commerce in the way that Amazon is. And you look at some of this stuff that's happening in effectively decentralized search with large foundation models. You could have a very big thing there that gets me very excited. As I mentioned, I think there's this really interesting way to think about the future decentralization of synthetic biology. A lot of what's happening in alternative energy could be either centralized or decentralized. Rooftop solar is a great example, and it's also a great example of the government using its platform power to say, we're going to, incentivize this rather than this, just like Facebook does. And they go, okay, yeah, we're going to incentivize decentralized rooftop solar, where the value win goes to individuals and reducing their energy bills, or we're going to say we're going to incentivize centralized, alternative energy, where the value all goes to the utilities. That's a choice, and that's really the point of my book. Technology is all about choices, and the governance of technology and the governance of society are increasingly becoming interconnected and versions of the same thing. And in some sense, the technology companies that we're all so hot and bothered about are also the key to our future, because they evolve very quickly. We can see where they go wrong. There's a lot of ability to fix and adjust and learn there. So let's use them as learning platforms to apply to the rest of society.
Very good. Wonderful way to end our conversation. Thank you very much, Tim.
You're very welcome. I really enjoyed it.
Good. Yeah, likewise. And anyone who wants to rewatch this, head to my YouTube channel, where you can also see many more conversations like this. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.